Thank you, Tracy, for the introduction. I also want to start by thanking the Singaporean Sports Institute for having this event. I think it's critical. I think of these opportunities as conversations, and the best ideas come out of conversation, but also a conversation of diversity. You look around the room from the perspectives and the cultural standpoints. This is where innovation comes from. And so I hope to be a part of that today by presenting, but also, again, I see it as a conversation. Exchanging of ideas and asking of questions. Please feel free to do that. I look forward to that. That gets fun to me. I have to apologize, like our first speaker, a little raspy voice, so you may see me put a lozenge in my mouth and hydrate. I'm not getting ready for a workout right after this, so just want to let you know I want to keep my voice and try to do the best I can for you. I'm going to talk about the performing brain, often the thing that's left out in high performance. We often assume that high performance starts from the neck down, but there isn't anywhere that the brain doesn't have a stake in the process. We always overlook that. Now, we also fall for these ideas of marginal gains. A great tagline, a great strapline by British Cycling. However, it's marginal gains because we're not looking brain first. And I'll talk a little bit about my experience. Everything is contextual. And so why have I come to these conclusions? It's become from my scholarly work, but also my applied work. So Tracy read my bio, but I'll try to go a little bit deeper but be quick about it. If we start from the left to the right, I find myself at 5 universities working in sports medicine and sports science. If you're not familiar with the NCAA, the National Collegiate Athletic Association, it trains almost 500,000 athletes. 1,100 schools. It does not just exist in the US. We have now 4 schools online in Canada. To give you a perspective, in the peer review literature, it's considered elite sport, just by the funding lines and the resources and the availability. If we look also where I spent 17 years as the performance director of the New England Patriots, devising a brain-first model. A brain-first model from a sports medicine standpoint, but also from a sports science standpoint, to provide competitive advantage. Also, if you move to the right, I've worked with the Department of Navy with their elite military for over a decade, and I've provided expertise in their movement to a high-performance model. And I humbly say that they are 25 years ahead of sport, because I find when things become life and death, we get a little bit more specific. We don't eyeball things. Mostly we go home after events, unless you're a Colombian soccer player, then you don't go home. In the military, things are very, very different. My newest appointments are with NASA, so working on, so that's the National Aeronautic and Space Administration, working on high performance and zero gravity, which actually comes with it some very, very interesting things to overcome, but also looking at concussion. So if you think concussion in collision sports is tough, try to break the atmosphere. And so we're trying to solve that problem. And then the knock-on effect, pun intended, is to assist sport with some of the answers that we find. I'm also a visiting professor at Queensland University of Technology in psychology, neuroscience, and biomedical sciences, and I also consult at the Australian Institute of Sport. And I started way back when Manchester United was coached by Alex Ferguson in the FA, and I helped develop their cognitive training. Over years, I've worked with certain special projects, one of them now being that they've admitted concussions happen, so I've been a part of that process as well. But this is my context. It has been grounded in a hybrid of research and applied practice. What I'm hoping to look at today is, if we're going to look at making a brain-first society, we have to look at the myths that we absorb, the myths that we may not even are aware of, that are kind of a part of our consciousness in our existence in day-to-day life, but also that really the context is we are brain-first performers. Again, there is nowhere in human health and human performance where the brain doesn't have a stake and isn't involved. And in fact, I have the pleasure of quite a bit of working in transdisciplinary teams, because I don't have all the answers. But it's collaboration with other scientists we get to better solutions. Because most problems in the world are due to a lack of knowledge. Now granted, you can't have all the knowledge for any given situation, but you can't stop from trying to pursue it and dare to find that knowledge. Look at whether we're also settling for those marginal gains, and that's my belief that we are in many circumstances. And then looking at how this brain-first model fits to a professional and elite coaching. And we're often forgetting that they're performers. And we'll get to that later. But also then looking at neurodiversity. Basically the concept that from 1859, Darwin has just been proven right over and over. We don't train groups. We train individuals. And neurodiversity is critical in that process, and we often overlook it. Let's start with one of the myths. I apologize for those who saw me speak at the Psych Association. There is some overlap, but there is some new stuff. I just want to be clear about that. This is one of the two biggest myths in sport. Mental toughness is not a thing, and grit is not valid science. But let's start with how. It really is marketing. So grit started with a concept called hardiness in the 1980s. It was evaluated by personality psychology, and they assumed they had taken it as far as they could through psychometrics. They had to start now looking at neuroscience and psychophysiology. But they just rebranded it. That's not science. In fact, John Kelly in 1976 coined it the jangle fallacy. That if I just change the name of something, now it's a new concept. So we've been following a false narrative for many, many years. It's a false equivalence. It has poor construct validity. It has poor reliability. It sounds plausible, but it only has the illusion of validity. And yet our cultures are embedded with this and ignores some very foundational pieces of neuroscience. But let's move on to grit. So grit, also a similar case, came from the term conscientiousness. Again, personality psychologists felt like they had taken as far as they can with psychometrics and understanding it from a subjective standpoint. If they were going to take the concept any further, we would have to look at brain imaging and psychophysiology. But Angela Duckworth at the University of Pennsylvania did research and was more than happy to generalize it to every environment, although her research was only done in education. But it is marketing. In meta-analyses, this is in science, how we take stock. This is how we make sense of the consensus of where we're at. By Marcus Crede and Andrew Schmidt, showed that grit accounted for only 3% of change in any learning environment. Let me break that down for you. That means just showing up to class was far more effective than any concept of grit. So these are false narratives. They are fueled by belief bias. But they also break one of the most deep principles of neuroscience. We are wired for survival. In fact, we're not wired that well for happiness. I'm hoping everyone in the room has experienced that. Maybe during my talk, that would be nice. But we are wired for happiness. We have the most sophisticated survival system in the known universe. And what these two concepts claim is some have it and some don't. No, it actually comes down to how you train neurophysiology. Having worked with one of the most elite militaries in the world, you can break a Navy SEAL. You can break an athlete. How do you scaffold the central nervous system demands along with all the other 11 systems? Here's another one that's a myth. Most of 20th and 21st science is focused on the neocortex, that wrinkly part we think of on the brain, that outer layer. But we don't even know what consciousness is. We have wonderful teams around the world examining it. But what we found out is it's an outgrowth of the lower parts of our brain, meaning we feel first, then think. So when we approach our athletes as coaches, as physiologists, as nutritionists, as sports psychologists, and we tell them just to think positively, nothing flows to the neocortex except through the lower centers that manage the brain, the heart, and the gut. So although it is bidirectional, we can influence through our thoughts, we have real control over our neurophysiology through the lower centers. And we have to start looking at that. So consciousness is a myth. It's a myth that we have such control over it. And in fact, majority of what an athlete does is not on the conscious level. It's about see and do. And everyone in the room has experienced this. 100 people, show of hands, have driven somewhere and have no idea how they got there. Show of hands. Yeah. Okay. You've just felt flow. You've just felt the zone. And its first point of contact is the lower center of the brain of managing emotion. You cannot get to consciousness except for the lower centers. So let's look at the advantage we ignore. So how many people have heard this? We use 10% of our brain. Show of hands. Yeah. Okay, this is never the case. If we use 10% of our brain, 20%, 30%, 50%, we would not have survived as a species. We are not the fastest and we are not the strongest. It's our survival through using all of our access to our brain that has allowed us to survive, allowed us to be high performers. Oh, this is one of my bed bugs. I do not like this term. How many people have heard muscle memory? Muscles do not have memory. Never have, never will. And I get the concept is quick communication. But if we're going to improve the health, and health is the foundation of human performance, and brain health, if you don't have brain health, you don't have health, and then the knock-on effect of improving performance, we have to tell well-packaged truth. Tell the truth to our athletes of how things work so they can be self-determined to manage those pieces. Actually, muscle memory is very complex. It has to do with the visual, or muscle movement, I should say, has to do with visual input, lower centers of the brain to the emotional center, and then going to the neocortex somatosensory, the ear-to-ear cortex, or circuit. I love this one too. Not emotional decision making. How many people have heard that? Okay, this goes all the way back to Greek times. This all goes all the way back to Plato, talking about these two horses in our psychic existence that we had to wrestle with. We had to wrestle with emotion and logic. There is no decision you ever make that isn't emotion a part of that process. And in fact, the more important the decision, more emotion is the driver. If we think about our athletes, it's about see and do, and emotions are our warning system. About how do we move? When do we move? Do we move? So this is an incredible myth that really stops the growth in our athletes. And actually their health. There's a condition called alexithymia. It comes in cultural context and in cultural and familial context, and not allowing people to actually have emotion and almost create a harassing and traumatic environment so they do not experience emotion, so they then cannot process. This is so critical because the vagus nerve, the longest nerve in the body, connects the brain, the heart, and the stomach. It wraps around the stomach. Everyone's heard of gut instincts? Yeah. Any mammal, you snip the vagus nerve on the front of the back of the stomach, they can no longer make decisions. Emotions are critical to our existence and our health. Left and right brain. No. Now, what is true about this statement is if you cut the brain in half on a human being, could they survive with one part of the brain? Yes. It will rewire and allow us to survive and perform. But we are not a left or right brained. Not at all. We use all of our brain, and the corpus callosum that connects both sides is critically important in high performance, to be able to interpret information. Okay, brains are like computers. Everyone heard this one? Okay. Tell you a little history about this. Arguably one of the smartest men in the world, John von Neumann, Hungarian mathematician and theoretical physicist, he actually theorized what all of you have right near you right now. A computer-human being symbiosis. How many people always know where their cell phone is? And we do know that in Finland right now, they're embedding chips under the skin so you don't swipe credit cards. You just scan your wrist. However, computers are designed off the early ideas about how the brain was designed. But the brain is far more complex for a computer. And it is far more capacity. And it is far faster. Figure about 2030 before we get a computer that can actually keep up with a human brain. So we are not computers. It's actually a bit of an insult to our functional level. How many people over 30 in the room? Okay, this ain't true, and thank God, right, for every one of us. We have this thing called neurogenesis. But we have to maintain certain aspects of brain health to produce neurogenesis. And so we'll talk about readiness and resiliency, but this is critical. And actually we have evidence of it in sport. How many athletes do we see that are competing in their 40s and longer now? Because sports science has improved in some of the aspects. Maybe not the brain aspect of it, but we've certainly improved other ways that have had effect on brain health. I mean, the good news is the brain's open for business. We just got to get rid of the myths, and we can start to take a hold of a brain-first environment. Because the inconvenient truth of sport, it's not stress, it's trauma. That's a subjective term. I can show you PET scans and CAT scans and brain imaging. The brain only knows trauma. It knows a small t or a big T, and what's the capacity of the human being to compensate. In fact, most of our athletes are very, very fit but unhealthy. And we don't assess that enough. And we never really don't assess it from the brain, but it's possible. But if we look at the exercise, and again, exercise being loaded properly is neuroprotective, but sport is not because of these impacts culturally. We often are not measuring load. If we do, it's only external. Thanks to the Australians, 30 years probably now with GPS, heart rate from the fins. We have a bit of understanding of the external, but we don't measure from the brain, but it's possible. And then we don't measure total load. I've heard many coaches talk about this. It's the hours away from the facility that undo the work that we're doing in the facility. It's because you're not measuring total load. The brain doesn't shut off when you leave the facility. It is still having to manage health and human performance. And without that data, it's an incomplete picture. And then we look at the organizational stress. When we get to elite levels, there is politics. When we get to pro levels, there's money. And all those things factor in on the certainly lifestyle stress. When we look at human resources issue, this, I think, is the biggest factor. We forget in high performance sport that we can have nice things, but if we don't have the human intelligence in performance centers, they don't run themselves. If you do not have human intelligence in every position of sports science and sports medicine, then you have a gap in your ability to implement a program that can enhance performance. Human intelligence. Human intelligence is what made that smartphone that's sitting next to you. And it was 4 people from Apple, because if it was 40, we would have never seen it. But it was 4 people. One of them was a psychologist who understood neurofeedback. That's why it was designed to be addictive, but that's another story for another time. Use your knowledge for good is what I say. The other piece of it is detrimental coaching climates. So we talked to the first part of today, wonderful conversations about integrity in sport. Right? What I didn't hear a lot about, I did hear complexity, and it is complex. Anyone that tells you that it's linear, A plus B equals C, stop listening. Everything is nonlinear. We have to start to understand that. But we have to look at the influences. You have to look where your exposure rates are. Most of the complaints are due to hostile coaching environments where the pedagogy is not being followed and they're not being supervised. So what does that do? Trauma. It's trauma. So let's look at why we're the best performers. Because again, we're not the fastest and the strongest. Oh, I remember, I got my pointer. So I think the cold medicine is slowing me down. I just remembered I have a pointer. So I was saying earlier, the lower centers of the brain, really the brainstem, the pons and the medulla, everything comes through there. You cannot skip to the cerebral cortex. Everything comes through there. And then into this area, the limbic system. It's our emotional system. So we feel first, then think. So that's why emotions are on top. This is how we sense safety. How we sense if a rugby player is to go left or right. They're processing information about safety. It's neurophysics. Then the emotion affects attention. It's actually, attention is a process. It's not an event. It's actually a tripart process. Tripart process of actually an alerting sequence. We have to start to alert to something, then we track, then we decide. And so, but it all stems on emotion. And obviously, all sport is working memory. What you're doing right now, if you're attending, I'm always the guy that gets the lecture before lunch. I'm the standing between you and food, or the guy after. So this is always interesting. But it affects memory. Emotions affect memory, working memory. So your ability to attend right now, critically important. And then it affects language, nonverbal and verbal, and nonverbal is faster. And that's all controlled by the vagus nerve in the brain. And then our ability to see things in space and make sense out of it. We are the best performers in the world because of these factors. But how we train our athletes is not brain first. We interfere with these at times. We, in fact, do things to absolutely disregard this process. But we have opportunities to change that. One of them is, again, well-packaged truth to those we work with. Those of you who have seen this before, this is the Truman brain model. It's just a nice way to show it. We know this not to be true now. We know that everything is interconnected, but separating it out makes it easier for me to teach it. So I want to admit that first. But this is where everything starts. Emotions run the show in sport and life. If you cannot manage them, then each sequence is disrupted. I'll give you an example from my experience, and I'll give them in a couple different places. Anything I talk about in my work with the elite military, I have clearance to do so I'm not creating any international incident. I just want you to know that. If you do ask me questions afterwards about some of the military work I've done, if I can answer it, I will. If I can't, I'll be very polite about it. But I'm going to start with a military example. So in parts of my military experience, I'm training snipers. All right? So a sniper has to remain calm, because if he doesn't, it changes the blood pressure of the visual system. So the eye changes. So the information to the visual systems and then to any other decision making is completely changed. We train them to manage their emotions by breath rate. Very similar to biathletes, ski and shooting. So very similar in biathlete, they may come to the range with a heart rate of 180, and they have to drop their heart rate in 2 breaths, about 80 to 50 beats. Otherwise, they will not be able to find motor skill and also make decisions. A sniper is the same way, but the weapon system snipers have create about 3 to 4 Gs of impact. So if you're not dropping your breath rate and controlling the emotional center of your brain, you're getting increasingly more micro traumas that are getting towards the concussion, which is then going to disrupt your ability to see and do. Give you an example from sport. So in American football, it came from rugby. Any of you who have watched it, there are some confusing parts, but you can see the heart of rugby, very much so. And if we look at a quarterback's play, which could be like right under center, they have 3 seconds to make a decision. And that's an emotional decision. We can figure out the math and the physics of what it is to throw a ball 60 yards accurately to hit someone. But they're not calculating math. There is no consciousness in that process. It's see and do, just like when you drove. And you can train these things, and we're not. And in fact, we over-rep physically. So we're overtraining them and dulling these learning sequences. But those two, among many, are a part of it. Is being able to see and do is emotional. It is not cognitive. It never has been. But again, one of the things about the history of science is often science moves in fads, and it also moves in access. There was a time when psychology really looked at psychophysiology. It's actually its earliest roots are in psychophysiology and neuroscience. However, having access to thoughts is convenient, and there is some power there, but they have to be matched with management of the brain and its energy. And in fact, because the brain is very selfish. And this is what I was talking about. Psychology is the preface. It's the first chapter. It's an important chapter. However, without these two, we don't have a more complete story. And we have access. Technology, there is technology that everyone could have on their iPhone that would give you an opportunity to train neurological responses, psychophysiology, timing, anticipation, decision-making. Assessment takes higher level technology. But as we know, technology can be used for good. And actually, that's one way, is having athletes use some apps that are helpful on their phone. It changes how we orient with phones. It also changes the opportunity to talk about how phones interfere with the process of a healthy brain, which it does. But we have to complete the picture. And right now, we're not telling well-packaged truth. We're not looking at these things, and they're very, very accessible. So let's talk about why this is so important. Again, tying in the narrative, but the brain is the center of human health and human performance, is that it runs 11 systems. There isn't anywhere that the brain isn't directing or receiving information. There's only one system, the enteric nervous system, that has special cells that can turn on. But they soon then, without the control of the brain, soon then alert the brain to what it's done. And there's actually more neurology here than here. So we don't eat for anything but to create neurotransmission. So many of the fads in nutrition, in fact, there's research currently out in the Journal of American Medicine that talk about textbooks in nutrition around the world in medicine have to be rewritten because we're not taking a brain-first approach and we're not understanding that the gut is critically important in this process and how our athletes feed. And again, nutrition is, again, not a one-size-fits-all. In my work in the elite military and the New England Patriots and elsewhere, I'm testing blood. I'm testing fecal matter. Because most athletes downregulate serotonin. And what's serotonin have to do with? Mood, attention, movement, everything we ask them to do well. But if we can apply a simple nutritional intervention, and we have the data, we eyeball in sport way too much. What gets measured gets managed. And that's what this process is about. Psychology is about the subjective experience, which is so critical to hear the story from the person, their experience. I was talking to others over the last couple days. We have a TV show in the U.S. where a journalist will go to, and I know they're not used all that much, so I wonder if the show is unfortunately going to get canceled, goes to a phone book, literally picks a name out, and then goes to interview this person. Because everyone has a story, and that story is incredibly important to the regulation of process. However, then we can get to the neurophysiology and psychophysiology to complete that narrative and prescribe better. But the brain runs everything. There's no way it doesn't. But we act in sport like it's this separate thing. Health is based upon brain health. Ask anyone that's been concussed. Ask anyone that's been dehydrated. They will tell you the effect of the brain. Let's look at a performance model that I often work with as well, driving the point home that the brain is the center of human performance. And again, going back to that piece that we have to manage emotions first, last, and always. Before I go there, I just thought of this, because I think I caught a cold on the plane, so I triggered this idea. How many people, a show of hands, have been on a plane in the last 6 months? Okay. The pilots always come on, introduce themselves, tell you the time, flight, the weather, where you're going to be. If your pilot got on the intercom and started sounding stressed, confused, and completely not ready to do the job of taking you from A to B, show of hands, how many people get off the plane? Yeah, emotions run the show. And so if we look at this model, and we look right at the neurophysiology, let's look at the no intervention. We're not managing emotion. So what happens? The 10th cranial nerve, the longest nerve in our body that connects our brain, heart, and our stomach. Think about the central part of our body that communicates out to the periphery, neuromuscularly, from movement. That downregulates. There's less information that it can handle, and it actually halts the information to be able to see and do. If we look at the sympathetic nervous system, it goes up. We're in survival mode. If we put our athletes in survival mode when the event is big enough, we've already put them on their back foot. Then if we look at being able to take in information, so from coaching, and I'm sure all of us have seen this, whether on TV or experienced it. Actually, I've talked about this a little bit with people. Seen a coach, very animated, giving instruction to his players. But you see the face of the players, and they're not able to really process. And then you talk to those players, and they broke the huddle, and they're like, what did he say? Let's just do this. So even our ability to learn and take in information when we can be calm at timeouts and at halftime is critically important to that regulation. But then we look at social withdrawal. When a team event is socially context, it's so important of connection, especially flow sports, where there's a knock-on effect of player-to-player initiating action. And we process very fast information visually and by sound. And so this takes that away. So when you're perceiving danger, you're having a situation in which performance is less consistent and certainly very difficult to manage. If we look at the intervention side, you're seeing all the physiological differences. Vagal tone is up, so your openness to your environment, your openness to manage energy, and manage energy efficiently. The brain's really selfish. It weighs 3 pounds. But all of us just ate. 60 to 80% of what you just ate went to the brain. Yeah, it's that selfish. It's that selfish. So when you are damaging your energy bank, and you're looking at 90 minutes, you're looking at huge amount of power output in 100 meters. You're changing the dynamic of what the brain can do and communicate to its periphery. Then, of course, you're more open if you're more regulated. And you're more open to take feedback and initiate feedback. We have a lot of times and breaks in sport where we can learn, engage, and improve. But if we're closed, if our central nervous system is threatened, all of those things get much more difficult. Much more difficult. And I must tell you, in a high-performance environment in the elite military, that side, you're likely dead. We're a brain-first model because the brain allows you to survive if you can manage it. In sport, we overlook that what's between your ears has a lot more to do with what will happen on the scoreboard. Let's go through a little pattern of the see and do since I've been mentioning it. So this actually gets into neurophysics. And actually, we in training sometimes overtrain our athletes, so our ability to take in proper patterns goes down, which also has a knock-on effect of really damaging their health. I'll give you an example. Hopefully none of you have seen it. I've seen it. A coach will initiate action with players, and they're not allowed to leave the pitch or the field until they get it perfect. Let's teach you some rules about neuroscience. None of you have ever seen perfection. In fact, the brain hates it. The first reaction to it is anxiety. Anxiety does not allow us to perform well, especially if it puts us out of bounds. And it actually really very much burns up a lot of energy. So the brain cannot produce perfection. So from a motor coordination and neuroperception standpoint, when you have a team practice out there until it's perfect, which is generally doesn't happen, they're learning patterns that they will never use. You're changing their ability to predict. The brain is a predictive brain. And so taking in information is critically important. That's about emotion regulation. But you can also train processing speed, working memory, using technology, and actually training environments that actually create simulations that are not going to be exactly what they see in short bursts of environmental stimulus. Because if you get closer and closer, you're training more than you should be. Give you an example. In the military, we use live ammo. There are fatalities at times. You try to minimize those. So you scaffold learning slowly. So the demands of being able to do that. But what do we do in sports? Sink or swim. So motion regulation leads to processing speed, leads to reaction time, leads to decision making. If you don't follow the training regimen of this, you are teaching them to process situations that they will not see. For example, anyone ever seen a soccer ball float in midair? There are predictable physics patterns in everything that's in sport. So we need to train them to see what they will experience. And often what we do is overdo that. I'm getting the hook. It's all right. Let's get to the coaching perspective, which I've touched on earlier. I will touch on this piece that I think is often overlooked. Coaches are performers. One of the first things I did when I worked with the New England Patriots was to think about things in functional systems. Coaches are like parents. You get far more working with them than you do with the kids. And if their health is poor, it has a knock-on effect on an inability to see the pitch,
create changes in tactics, to create changes in dynamics. And so coaches' health is critically important throughout the whole life cycle of a coach. They are performers. Coaches often in certain flow sports can make a substitution that changes the dynamics of the game almost immediately. And I'll tell you a quick story about that. I was called to work with a National Collegiate Athletic Association team, American football team. They played in the national championships. Just to give you an idea of what that's like, their team won home game just with ticket sales for $4.5 million US. It's elite sport. Very critical point in the game, down in distance. They had to decide, like rugby, what are we going to do? Again, it's stops and starts, but what are we going to do? So the call goes to the offensive coordinator. Set up the tactics, set up the strategy. He couldn't make the call. It's not that he couldn't make the call because he didn't have the declarative knowledge. He couldn't make the call because he hadn't slept in 3 days. He did not have the conscious awareness to process the information, which had a knock-on effect of panic on the sidelines, which impacted the team, the players, as well as the coaching staff. Our coaches have to be thought as performers, and then they also have to be thought as professionals. They're educators. Education is clearly important at this point. I see all my coaches as college professors, and this is the example I use. Think about the most difficult course you ever took. If your teacher stood over you and screamed at you, would it have made it any easier? Our connection has to do with pitch and tone and facial reaction. The coaches I work with, we train that, just in the same way as elite military. That you train that for high-pressure situations. Because we are trained in our central nervous system to hear sound waves. And coaches, when they yell, it's a low tone. And that is an embedded survival mechanism. That's why children mate or connect or with their mother quicker than their father. The tone of voice. It's not just that mother provides nutrition. So when we scream at our athletes, we discharge a dysregulation of their brain. So as coaches, we have to think about us as performers and educators and enhance that professional development. Go on this one real quick. He's going to come down and get me. I mentioned this earlier, and this is part of my work in the elite military and part of my work with New England Patriots, as well as, and we'll talk a little bit about it next, so I'll just touch on it briefly, is to look at how people learn. I've known for a long time there is no neuroscience on learning styles, but there is on input. Some people have a stronger visual input. We all use the same, but we may have differences of what we like. Some people read books, some people listen to books. Is that if we're not understanding how our athletes learn, we're missing an opportunity from the first step to set a program in place in which learning does not bog down, but it is enhanced. We make a mistake in sport of following education's lead. Most education hasn't changed since the 1950s. It's mass production. Yeah, we have technology, but you sit people in a chair and everyone's supposed to learn the same way. That's not how it works. And so when we invest on understanding how our athletes learn and how the brain learns, we invest on changing our cultures. We also invest on coaches understanding, if you understand learning, then there's less frustration. So there's more emotional management by them too, because there's a by proxy investment. Summary. If you read nothing, read the top. Brain health equals athletic well-being equals performance. There is no other formula. You cannot build human performance on a lack of health. That's not how it works. It never has, it never will be.